I felt to share with you something from a book by Blake Healy called The Veil. I kind of like the title because it reminds me of Isaiah 25, where it says that the Lord is going to remove the veil that is cast over the nations. So in this one, it's about wounds, but there's some interesting stories here. Okay, so I'll start. There was a man who attended the same prophetic group as I did, he said, when I was 13 and still coming to terms with my newly discovered talents. He's talking about the prophetic. We'll call him Chuck, since that's not his real name, and I don't think I actually know anyone named Chuck, so Chuck was a nice guy. But he was one of those people who always had something to say. Anytime there was an opening for prayer requests, he had a list. Every time he prophesied, he did so at the top of his lungs. And whenever I entered into conversation with him, it quickly distilled into a long description of his weekly woes. You all probably know a Chuck or two. Despite the general liking I have for humanity as a whole, Chuck bothered me. I didn't hate him or anything, but I wouldn't have minded if he found another prophetic group, maybe in India or something. Oh dear. When I looked at Chuck in the spirit, I saw cuts and scars all along his face. They were different lengths and depths each time I saw him. Sometimes there would be one long, deep cut from his nose down to his jaw, and he'd ask for prayer because his son was doing drugs again. Other times, a thick red scar, oops, this thing is moving, would appear along his cheek. And he'd tell the story about his ex-wife for the third time. Sometimes there would be clusters of scratch marks spread all across his face, and he'd dissolve into tears talking about how life was just too overwhelming. I would have felt sorrier for him if this weren't a weekly occurrence. One week, while doing my best to ignore the bleeding slice that cut across his left eye, I was inexplicably drawn to a spot at the center of his chest. Though he was thoroughly clothed, I could see through his shirt to a dark bruise at the center of his sternum. It was no bigger than a golf ball and had dark blue and green rings emanating from a navy blue center. As soon as I saw the bruise, a picture flashed through my mind. I saw a little boy no older than 10 crying with his chin pressed to his chest. The boy's father was standing over him, veins popping and eyes bulging, livid. He grabbed the boy's chin and jerked it up, shouting, "Look at me." The boy cringed and cried all the harder. Taking his hand off the boy's face, the father yelled, "You stop it. You stop crying," punctuating the last 3 words with hard 2-fingered pokes to the boy's chest. "Nobody wants to hear you blubber on all day. You stop that now," he shouted, with one final jab at the same spot. I was never bothered by Chuck after that. I felt as if I should say something to him like there was a way to break the words that his father had thumped into his chest, but I never did. I was only 13. But even then, it made me sad to see what one man's words could do. I imagine that if Chuck knew what his Father in heaven had to say about him, things would be quite different. Wounds are sadly something I see on people all the time. I see them almost every day. Whether it's from your boss being disappointed with a project you put your heart into, your wife snapping at you because you forgot to pay the water bill, or just another off-kilter look from that person you're trying to be friends with. We hurt each other. You can pretend it isn't there or that it didn't bother you, but you know if it did. Not all wounds are the same, of course. Some fade away within hours, others heal into scars that never fully leave. And still others are not allowed to heal, festering into rotten gashes that corrupt muscle and bone. How these wounds affect you is fortunately and unfortunately entirely up to you. I've met people who have let one idle word drag them into a dark pit of unforgiveness, bitterness, and self-pity, while others turn a past full of abuse and shame into a crown of glory by giving it over to the one who died to heal every hurt. It's not quite that simple, and this is my opinion, because it takes some time spent in inner healing and what you'd call soul healing, for you to get free. So you can turn it over to the Lord, and that's an act of faith, but you have to work through and face pain. Anyway, I could get into that real big time right now, but I want to share these things. I knew a woman on the prophetic team who was very talented, and she had a natural gift for hearing the voice of God and showed great authority when she told people all the good things God had to say about them. Despite this, I couldn't help but notice the faint line that ran from her right ear to the corner of her mouth. It didn't look like much, hardly more than a thin strip of irritated skin, yet it never seemed to improve. One day we were prophesying together over a middle-aged man with a pornography problem. Statistics suggest that this situation wasn't unusual, but this man's problem was more evident than most. I would see the demon hopping in circles around his head, poking at different places on his face, smiling as it did. Although I've seen demons of perversion attack plenty of people, it certainly doesn't mean all those people had problems with immorality. Because, I'm adding, they can be tormented in their thoughts, but not acted out, right? I could tell this man had a problem because of the look of shame that came to his face every time the demon touched him. I didn't know what to say to the man. Remember, at this time he's like 13. Now I know I should have told him he was a man of honor and integrity and that God had made him to be an example of purity, which was true. My talented prophetic partner, however, seemed to know exactly what she wanted to say to him. Her face grew redder and redder with each measured breath, and then she opened her mouth to speak. The line that ran from her ear to her mouth split open, causing her jaw to swing loose and hang from one hinge. The fleshy bits underneath were full of maggots and rot. Ugh. By this point, I had been aware of my gift for a few years, so I was quite accustomed to seeing both shockingly grim and breathtakingly beautiful things appear out of nowhere. I also rarely reacted externally to their appearance, but this time I jumped, probably because I genuinely hadn't been expecting it. She proceeded to give the man a prophetic word about how he needed to change his ways and that opportunities were passing him by because he wasn't able to see them. As she spoke, I tried my best to figure out what had caused the extreme spiritual and verbal reaction. I was perplexed till I noticed that the demon was floating directly between my friend and the person she was prophesying to, causing her to see through the demon, as it were, a filter. Seconds later, I noticed the odd staging of the scene. The demon hovered into my line of sight in front of the man, and through the demon, the man's features were subtly exaggerated and twisted in sinister fashion. Even I began to feel a measure of contempt rise in my stomach. I had to actively choose to connect with what God was saying about the man, to keep the religious beast that was churning in my stomach from condemning him. My partner somehow managed not to delve too far into the accusatory realm, but the man sure didn't look very encouraged after hearing what she had to say. I found out sometime later that she had been in a very abusive marriage several years prior. It made me sad that even though she got remarried to a great man and had 3 wonderful children with him, that the abusive relationship still left its mark on her life. Wounds that go untended, which was my point earlier, skew our view not only of those around us, but ourselves. While part of the strategy of the demonic is to deceive us into believing lies about ourselves, the other part is trying to get us to believe lies about others. I don't know why we feel the compulsion to condemn. Maybe it makes us feel better about ourselves, or perhaps our sense of justice comes tweaked by our own wounds. Whatever the reason, this is not how God treats people. He sent his son to die and erase our sins from the records. He came to make us blameless before the Father. Okay. Demons have no authority over you unless you give it to them. A demonic entity has no right to act in your life without expressed agreement from you. Showing up with a red pitchfork in one hand and a contract in the other is probably not going to win the devil too many souls. So instead, he must look for soft soil in which to plant lies and deceit. I'm not going to delve into that particular doctrine right at the moment, because there are plenty of people in history that were tormented by demons without giving them permission. Martin Luther had some issues, so maybe that's why he had some torment. Madame Guyon, I can't say the same, okay? But people who are called by God prophetically and apostolically are going to get hammered by the enemy, and it's how we deal with it, how we deal with that will change, the atmosphere and our ability to be less vulnerable. Once a woman came to our church, I'm going to continue, who liked to prophesy during worship. Generally, this wouldn't have been an issue. The problem was the words she spoke, like, feel the magic of his breath course through your bosom. Can you taste his power flowing from the earth? And submit your will to his advances and let yourself be taken by him. Whoa. It may seem rich for the guy who talks about demons morphing out of ceilings to pass judgment on someone saying strange words during a church service, but the feeling that emanated from what she said was even more bothersome than the words themselves. The leaders asked her to stop. She didn't, so they asked her a little more firmly. She stopped for a week, and then she started up again. After a few weeks of this song and dance, they asked me to look at her to see what was going on. I saw a metal clasp around her neck. It had a black chain that hung between her and a demon that sat on her shoulder. The demon was bony and pointed with thin wings and a gaunt face, standing no more than 2 feet tall. The demon sat on its haunches, picking at her hair like a pet monkey until there was a pause in the worship music. Then it pulled its long hands from her hair and jabbed at her neck with a pointed finger. It must have always poked the same spot because a red, raw hole about as big as round as a pencil had been dug out of the side of her neck. Ugh. When it poked, she winced as if some part of her was trying to resist, but then she immediately began sharing her tainted words. I saw them drifting out of her mouth, glitter-dusted flower petals floating in a sickly green haze, dancing the line between pleasant and putrid. I guessed that it would, if I could smell what I saw, it would smell like the overbearing potpourri you find in funeral home bathroom. Deception trying to hide under a sheepskin of revelation. Our worship leader, which is called divination, I'm adding that. Our worship leader, having had his fill of the woman's weekly declarations, slammed everything into full swing with a few hardcores that drowned out the prophetic word. There's something that happens when somebody is demonized and speaking out of a religious spirit, and if there are people who have true discernment, they'll be aggravated by what comes out of that person's mouth because they're reacting, their spirit is reacting to the demon, okay? So I can understand, them just like, shh, let's drown this baby out. The congregation seemed to appreciate this stance on the situation because everyone immediately joined in singing at the top of their lungs. The presence of God came quickly and tangibly, bringing a warm weight to the air. The demon's look of indignation matched the flushed anger that cut across the woman's face. It jammed its finger deep into her neck, making her visibly jump. At that moment, I wondered how a demon could exist in an atmosphere so thick with the presence of God. Just then, worship swelled to a new height. The demon's look of anger melted into one of abject terror. It leaped from the woman's shoulder, flapping its wings wildly. Then I noticed the chain that hung from the woman's neck was attached to a clasp around the demon's wrist. It yanked at the chain frantically, clawing at the trapped wrist with its free hand. The demon was just as tied to the woman as she was to it. Our fears, grudges, and wounds let demons in, and our fears, grudges, and wounds make it impossible for them to leave. These pains and attitudes may seem insurmountable at times, And that is because they are. I've seen enough moldy bandages and porcelain masks.